It's 12 o'clock in Frisco, Texas, and it's time for Smoker Broker Radio with Robert Mesh, a.k.a. the Smoker Broker. Robert is the owner of Small World Realty and has employed hundreds of real estate agents in his 17-year career. He has instructed and mentored over 10,000 real estate agents at the highly acclaimed Champions School of Real Estate and is considered an expert in Texas residential realty. Robert is also an advocate of true entrepreneurial spirit and has helped many to transition from corporate America into the world of self-employment. And now live from the studio to your world, the Smoker Broker.
Hey, welcome to Smoker Broker. I'm Robert Mesh, and I am the guy they call the Smoker Broker. Hope everything's going well. It's hard to get a name like Smoker Broker. You have to be a competitive barbecue guy. You have to be a real estate guy, and that's not found too often out there. So it's a name I go by all the way across the state of Texas. A lot of people know me by that name, and I enjoy having it because I love barbecuing and I love doing real estate. I love doing real estate more because that's my livelihood, but got to have something to cut up on, and that's why I like to do the barbecue. It's been tough barbecuing, though, because of all the COVID stuff out there. It's hard to, we don't do the events that we used to do. So it's kind of been a little difficult and not so fun. But it's hard to say anything's kind of fun with COVID going on. But I have noticed that we've kind of started getting back out and having some more planned events. So maybe that starts improving just a little bit. And maybe we get back to some type of normalcy with that as we get into the next year and we get some of the events back on there. But I do miss it. I have been smoking a lot, though. I've been out there. I've been working on some of the stuff we typically do all the time, and maybe on some new stuff too. It's like you never kind of forget it. So always kind of fun to do that. Real estate wise, big news outside. Well, I don't think it's big news. It's news that everybody else is already aware of. But housing stats, they rose September 9.4%. 9.4% rise in existing home sales via the National Association of Realtors in a time of a pandemic that's never been seen. That's pretty crazy. It's pretty crazy to think that in one of the times that we've been at our weakest, that we are at a point where we are surging. I've talked about it on the show quite a bit, and I don't apologize for it anymore, but it is hard. There are some industries that have struggled greatly. There are some people that you've met and that you know personally that have struggled greatly. So it's hard when you try to put a positive spin on anything that's COVID related. It's like you have to just have your tongue in cheek because you want to try to be as positive as you can. But there are some people, no matter what, it's been tough on them. And we realize that, and I try to balance it the best I can. I'm not going to ignore the fact that there are some positives out there. But we certainly respect those people that have had trouble, and God forbid if they've had, true health issues or even death from it. That's been hard to take as well. But we are one of the few industries that have been thriving. And, I guess sometimes I feel just a tad guilty about it because in the beginning, it's funny, I was talking to a friend last night who's in manufacturing, and we were discussing how all of us in the same thing in March, we were like, I don't know where this is going to go. We've talked about on previous shows that we lost a great amount of deals in March. Personally, it cost me about, I want to say $250,000, $300,000 just in the up and coming months that disappeared. And it kind of just makes you worry just a little bit when that happens, especially if you have 130 agents that work with you. Because if you're experiencing it, it means they're going to experience it. So there was a little bit of worry there, and it was short-lived. Thankfully, it was, because then we got into this just sick increase in house sales that we've been riding ever since, and we've had record months. All of us, not just SWR, not just Keller Williams, but all the brokerages, record months in this time frame. So it's just an interesting period. I continue to be asked every week, when do we see the housing market settling down, or do we anticipate a drop? And the answer is no. I don't see it in the immediate future. I don't see it in spring. I don't see it next summer. And quite honestly, I don't even see it inside the next year. I've talked about it on several shows, and sometimes I repeat myself on some of the shows, but only because the information's important. We try to talk a little bit about COVID and how it affects us on each show, because it does affect us real estate wise. So I've mentioned this one several times, and I'm going to mention it again. The only thing that I really keep my eye close to is I watch very carefully we've had high unemployment since COVID has hit, but it's the class of unemployment that is important to watch. Unfortunately, the numbers, I don't even remember what they are there, 11, 14, or 21, something like that. I'm going to bring Jim and Gary in here in a second, but it's high. But a lot of it has been from lower tiered wage people, all the service industries that had to let people go because they couldn't let people in. And fortunately for us, that doesn't hurt us very much because those are not the people that typically are buying homes. So what we've been watching is we know that unemployment number is high, and it's something that we pay close attention to. But the thing that we're really careful about as these companies move in, they're starting right now to plan what 2021 looks like. Obviously, many of them have figured out they can cut overhead and cut the staff and still run and do what they need to do, at least in most industries. That's not true for a lot of them, but you're going to see a surge in how do we restructure that? Do we need these many people? Do we need this massive commercial building? So you're going to see that roll into 2021. And the thing that I keep my eye on, it's the only hesitation I have, and it's a small one, is when those people that start making 100,000 to 250 or 300,000, if the middle tiered and the upper level management, if those guys, when I say guys, I mean guys and gals, when those guys start having cuts and losing jobs, that could put a little bit of a hesitation on the housing market. That could cause just a little bit of uncomfortableness. Now, the other side that makes me not worry as much about that, and I've talked a lot about this too, is the market's so low on inventory right now. It's so low on inventory. Money is so cheap to borrow that there's a backfill that even if that happens, you have so many people that want to buy houses right now that actually can't, or they can't get the ones that they want, that those people are waiting in line. And if that does happen, even though it's going to cause a decrease in some purchasing power, other people will still have it. And I think it's really going to keep the housing market going. I don't foresee the housing market really even having a hiccup inside the next year and really in the next 2 years. Those rates are not going to go up. The government's all but said they're not going to mess with them. I mean, they might go up. God forbid, they might go up to 4 or 5%, but they're not going to be at 6 or 7 or 8 for a long time, if ever. The federal government realizes that the housing market is what the economy stands on, and they're going to continue to make sure that that stays afloat. So for real estate agents, and we have a lot of real estate agents that watch the show, we average anywhere from 400 to 1,100 archive views a week. So there's a lot of people that watch the show for information, not only on current real estate, but the topics that we discuss. So that should be good news for everybody. It's good for up and coming agents. It's good for veteran agents as well, because we benefit from it too. I think one of the hardest things for a lot of the new agents out there has been, and I discuss this with my crew all the time, and like I said, I'm going to bring Jim and Gary here in a second. They run our stuff down in the Hill Country in Austin and San Antonio, and it's tough for them as well because we're normally seeing the people we bring in. We talk to them, we recruit them, and then we kind of nurture them in as they come into the system. But that has not happened in the last 6 months, and we've got people that we personally have not even met, and some of our offices, depending on what locations they're in, have been closed, even as of recently as last week. So it's difficult for the new agents as they're coming in to really get some type of comfortability. Now, there's obviously been training, virtual like everybody's doing, but that's not the same for a lot of agents. So for the new agents out there, we always have takeaways from the show. Our first takeaway today is going to be, look, if you're new and you're feeling disconnected because you're not actually going into the office, don't. All right? That's okay. It's very normal right now. Yes, we are all in agreement that this is not the greatest time for a new agent to come in because of COVID, but it's still a good time for an agent to be a real estate agent. And there's a big difference between the two. So those of you who do feel disconnected, the offices always have a lot of in-person training. We do our shows, we do our training with our crews as well. And you are starting to see, really in the last month is the first time that all the locations that we're at, we're finally starting to see an opening where there's physical actual meetings. And I think that's going to help a lot of the new folks out there, because quite honestly, they just haven't had that in 6 months. So don't panic with it. Just keep moving forward, and everything's going to be fine with that. It is difficult, we know that, but you can get past it, and you're in the right industry right now. That's what you got to keep the eye on. That's what you got to keep your eyes on, because that's what's happening. All right, we are going to talk about probably the most difficult concept to discuss in real estate. And what's great about that, and this is my fault, because I've done the show for 2 years, and I've always had a set crew that I bring on, and it's terrible because Jim and Gary are not local to me. They're in Austin, San Antonio, and quite honestly, I just forget sometimes that they can be on the radio show, because we used to do the show where it was live and people would come in, so they're really never on the list. And I finally got to the point where I'm like, they should be on the show every once in a while because of their expertise and what it is that they do. So I couldn't have picked a better show for them to be on, because this is an upper level discussion we're having. This is not the most simplistic one. There are veteran agents that could watch this particular show that actually do not understand the topic, because it's just something that's not taught all that often. And of course, we're talking about intermediary agents. We discussed this last week. We kind of opened it up with, the basis of agency. We talked about the IABS. We talked about customer and clients and why that relationship is important. And we kind of set the stage for this one, because you had to know that stuff before we discuss what we talked today. So let me introduce, I've been telling me to introduce them. I haven't done it yet. Let me introduce the two guys that I got. Jim McCauley up here. He's my guy down in Austin. He's a longtime friend, just an expert in real estate, new construction, and does a fantastic job with the recruiting of our folks down in Austin. He is an expert in the real estate arena in the material that we're going to discuss. Jim, it's great to have you. Good to see you, buddy. I always like to get to see you. I don't see you near as much as I probably should. So really good seeing you. Hope everything's going well in Austin.
Oh yeah, staying really busy.
And it is, right? The market's still good down there. I like to see things open up. Yeah, I like to see it looks like COVID's easing up the restrictions a little bit down there. It hadn't been so like that for the last few months, has it?
No, still, like you said, I can go into the office, but I can't bring any clients or anything like that. So
that's right.
But
they're working on it.
Yeah. So it's really kind of tricky, and showing things has loosened up. You still got to wear your mask and things like that.
I don't think that's going away. I think that's going to be with us for quite some time. The ridiculous part about the mask is so I got to be careful. I always got to be careful, because mask is such a political conversation. This is an opinion, okay? And it's a good one as far as if you listen to the whole thing. I personally don't like the mask. It is. I don't care what I say. I've heard that people go, "Oh, the mask isn't difficult." I'm like hell, it's not. It's hard to talk on it, and it suffocates the living hell out of me. Mm-hmm. But with that said, I do adhere to and agree that I think the masks are important when we're out in public. I have friends that don't believe that, and they actually will sometimes test that. And that's fine. To each their own opinions, but to sit there and say it's not uncomfortable, it is uncomfortable. And it's gross too. There's so much bacteria. You have to wash those masks all the time. God forbid the people who don't, and it's tough to do it. So I don't think it's going away. I think the masks are going to be there for quite some time. Honestly, we probably should have, even when in heavy flu seasons, we probably should have adapted something like that anyway. So I don't think that's really going anywhere. So I'm kind of starting to adapt to that. Got my buddy down there, Gary Ritchie, who he too is by far an expert in real estate. He runs our San Antonio crew down there. And, Gary's always a special person in my life, because Gary's pretty much the guy who taught me a lot of the stuff I learned to be an instructor. I can't tell you how much I love having him work with us and wanting to be a part of the real estate world again and getting back into it. But Gary is no doubt an expert in this subject. He is considered the one that really fathered all of us in teaching us how to teach prep. And in prep, that is where we start discussing this agency balance. So he knows a lot about this. And, Gary has such a way about him. Anybody who watches, he won't tell you like a straight out of the book. He'll give his real life examples in there. And it couldn't be a better show for him to be on today either, because he knows so much about it. Gary, how are things down in the New Bronzeville area?
Well, it's going really, really well. I'm going to kind of echo Jim and let you guys know that, just because this pandemic has restricted some things, it seems as though the real estate industry is kind of like overall
Yes.
ignored it. Not in shutting down. I just had a 30-minute conversation this morning with a commercial broker friend of mine in the San Antonio, New Braunfels, Bernie area.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy told me he just wrote 6 contracts in the last 10 days on high-end commercial transactions that are going to break ground probably in 2021.
So, what's
And I
interesting about
said,
that, Gary, I think a lot of people have feared that the commercial side, in fact, what I was just talking about, how there might be some downsides to that, but I want to clarify that statement because that's true. But then there's a lot of rebuilding and recreating of new offices that are built towards that new concept. And the fact that the people who are wanting to build commercial or buy someone that has commercial, that there are opportunities out there for them. So that doesn't surprise me. We're seeing that too.
In our conversation, I said, well, is it slowed down? And he says, only in certain sectors.
Right.
And I think what we're seeing is a refocusing of how the future is going to be transacted in the real world of real estate.
Right.
It's
Exactly.
going to be a little bit more virtual.
Yeah.
But as far as housing, things of that nature, he said multifamily, developers are going big guns. Residential, I just got a shocking eye opener last week in the New Braunfels market and North San Antonio and certain outlying areas, and Jim's probably can also confirm this. We thought we had about a 3 or 4 month inventory. Well, it turns out statistically we've got a 1.2 month inventory.
Right.
1.2 months, and I'm going, oh, well. So you guys that are out there in the real world of real estate and thinking that things are slowing down, quite the opposite. I think that there's a frantic sense of urgency that this pandemic has created, that if you're going to make a move, then you better do it now. The interest rates went down a little bit just this past week. I was talking to my son, who's a mortgage originator, and he said, Dad, I never thought it would get this low ever.
Gary, what's the highest you ever paid what's the highest interest rate you ever had on one of your houses?
Well, now you're starting to date me, Robert, but I remember I bought and wrote a contract on a house, and I was really excited that I was only going to have to pay 15.9% for an owner-occupied 30-year fixed-rate mortgage.
I love
15.9.
What's that, Jim?
I won't tell you what. I won't tell you what year it was.
What'd you say, Jim?
Said my first house was 12%. So
It's funny. It's so hard when the kids today they're like, oh, my rate went up like 1/4 of a point. I'm like, oh, poor you and your 3.75 and your free money that you're getting right now. It's they're so oblivious to it,
Tell you something else, striped houses here, builders cannot keep up. Lumber is spiked about 35%. And
right.
Lot sales are like crazy right now.
Well, that's another thing I want to point out too. And again, I'm very fortunate to have the people I do that work with me, and we work together doing all this stuff. But these guys right here, you've got about, well, I probably will date y'all if I say it, but I'm going to tell you right now, between those two over here on the side, that's about, it's 70 years for sure between the two of you, maybe more. And then, I mean, I'm considered new with you guys, and I'm on 20. So they're literally, there's almost 100 years of real estate experience on this podcast right now. And I think that that's just something that's very beneficial for everybody out there, because, we're going to talk about Intermediary, but we're also talking about what's happening inside of the market. These guys are making comments that way back when would have never existed. They're just like, that's not even possible. Yet here we are now talking about these interest rates with this cheap money. And then listen to what Jim said. Jim's talking about these housing projects, but then he said in the same breath that lumber is through the roof. No pun intended. I mean, it's expensive right now for the materials, yet they're still building. So those are all good signs of a healthy market. We do wish there was more inventory, and it's so terrible to say in the position that I'm in. I almost want there to be just a little bit of a slowdown so that the market can add some inventory, but I just don't think we're going to see it. All right, let's talk about intermediary. We laid down our foundation last week. Now we're going to get into, we stopped where we started talking about a buyer's rep agreement. So I want to talk to y'all about that because this is kind of a fun conversation, I guess from a comical sense, because this is the first area where some people get confused. A lot of people believe that the buyer's rep is what basically says that if you're true agency or not, and a lot of people will define it that if you don't have a buyer rep agreement, that you're automatically a sub-agent. That's a misunderstood. There's possibilities to that, but it's a misunderstood topic because here's the thing. And again, apologies for, I know we go, a lot of people watch us nationwide and listen to us nationwide. This is going to be more Texas geared, but this is all the same conversation for dual agency in other states. So it still should have valid validity to what you're talking about. But in Texas, verbal agency, it's legal, all right? It's not suggested, and it's certainly not something that we encourage, but it's legal. Now, the reason why that's important is when you start talking about sub-agency and you start talking about representation, this is where the buyer's rep, I'll unfortunately call it the bra, and a lot of people don't like that, but look, it's just initials, right? So unfortunately about the bra is what basically says that we are officially client and agent, and all my duties and responsibilities and we documented it, which is absolutely the way we want this done. And per the conversation that we're having today, and here's another takeaway as we get into intermediary, and I'm going to be hypocritical in a second because I'm going to go the opposite way, but you should know when you are getting into an intermediary relationship, you do not have a choice. You do have to have a bra because it's the only place where we have written explanations that say you are willing and accepting of doing this. So if you are, those of you who don't do the bra, and a lot of you don't, which is surprising, but a lot of you don't, you can get away with that a lot of times. But the one issue you can't get away from it in is an intermediary. You actually have to give written permission from those clients to do the intermediary. So we're going to talk about a lot about that here in the next 20 or so minutes as well. So here's the thing about the bra. I'm going to give you a good example. Just so for those of you who doubt to say, well, I have to have a bra to be a true agent. I'm going to use my brother as a good example. So if my brother comes into town and he wants to purchase a house, so he tells me he wants me to be his agent, at least he better. And then he says he wants me to do everything that I'm supposed to be a good real estate agent, right? He wants me to give my advice, my opinions, which we talked about this last week. This is huge in this conversation, right? So he tells me that. All right, now, not that I would ever do this, but let's just say I did anyways. Let's say I said, well, my broker requires that you sign this bra and this IABS because that's the procedures that we have in place. So then he just sits there and he looks at me. He goes, you're kidding me, right? You can't possibly think that you want me to sign something like that. He goes, I think we're good. I'm like, okay, whatever. Not again, we didn't go through this, but I want the example to be there. So he tells me to act on his behalf, tells me to give my advice and opinions to him, which again is referring to the actions of a client. We don't do that with the customer. We do it with the client, right? So I go through, find him some houses. We go look at a bunch of houses. Let's say he finds a house that's like $700,000 out there. He gets it. He goes to me and he says, I want you to tell me what you think, which is a trigger word for an opinion. I want you to tell me what you think it's worth, and I want you to tell me what you think we should go in at. I want the best value on this house. Okay, so he's begging me for advice and opinions. So I go ahead, I research it, I do everything. I tell him I think you should put an offer of $675 on this house. I think they'll meet us somewhere in the middle. We go through it. That's exactly what happens. He buys the house for $685, and I get paid a 3% commission. Now, I would ask anybody that's listening to right now, from the beginning to the end of that transaction, was I not always his buyer agent? Did he not, in fact, tell me he wanted me to be his agent? Mm-hmm. Did he not, in fact, ask me for my advice and opinions? And did I not clearly do that and get the best deal I could have for him? There was no bra. I didn't sign a bra with him. Now, here's where the problem with that is. Let's say Michael and I, my brother, getting a spat 24 hours before close, and he wants to stick it to me, and he says, you are not my agent anymore. Now, all that time that I spent up until then, I have been volunteering, because there is nothing I can do to insist that he is actually my client. Now, I can try to go in court and prove that there's all these discussions and all these emails, but the courts are very hasty when it comes to you have no written agreement that said you were his real estate agent. So that's why it's encouraged to have the bra. But for you to sit there and say that you're automatically a sub agent just because you don't have the bra, that's not true. And it's because of verbal agency. It's because the verbal agency is in there and it's allowed. Now, Gary, it's funny. We teach guys all the time about the bra, and we still do to this day because it's the right thing to do. But would you not agree that there's a lot of people out there that do not use that document?
Oh, absolutely. And it just mystifies me that all the hard lessons in life are the ones not that, oh, well, we kind of get by with it, so forth and so on, or when something jumps up, like you have a close friend or a relative, and just perfectly on that example. And I know Jim's been a party to this too, being a builder, where you have a client that shows up after the agent has invested all this time, all this frustration, all this anxiety, finds the perfect house. And then the buyer says, well, honey, let's go look at the house. And they happen to run into the builder while they're out visiting their new house, which is under contract possibly, but there's no buyer rep agreement in place. So basically, they strike up a conversation with the builder, who may have or may not have some of the finest reputation and ethics out there in the real world. And they say, well, you know what? We're afraid that we're probably not going to qualify. We're borderline. If we could drop the house by XYZ dollars, which happens to be about 3 or 4%, then there'll be no problem qualifying. Well, what is the builder going to automatically do?
Yeah. Well, he's
going to say, well, if we didn't have to pay your broker this exorbitant rate, we could probably come off the price because, I'm not benefiting from that, and so forth and so on. So what happens? They possibly strike a little side deal to reduce the price by the broker fee and cut the broker out altogether. Now, I will testify in a court of law. I've had this happen to me. The exact scenario. Not once, but twice. I'm not as smart as most people. The first time I thought, oh, well, hey, this, that, and the other thing. The second time, I had a very, very high producing real estate bride. And she looked at me and she said, you know what, as many years as you've been doing this and as much experience as you have, she said, you should know better than to work in the real estate business as this was her words exactly, stupid volunteer. I said, what do you mean by stupid volunteer? She said, well, you're out here dancing around acting like a real estate agent, and you have all the liabilities of a real estate agent because everything you say and do on their behalf, you could be held financially as well as legally liable for. However, you stupidly are volunteering. They have signed nothing saying that they are going to pay you a dang thing.
Yeah,
so don't be a stupid volunteer.
Everybody the people who are watching and that will watch on archive this week, look, that's the great part about having, Jim's over here smiling because he knows he's gone through it. And Gary has such a perfect explanation. I don't think you can appreciate how important the show is for knowledge in these types of subjects, because they're basically telling you in a very friendly way. They're saying, this is the type of stuff that has happened to us. These are the things that happened to us. This is why we don't do those things anymore, or at least we know better than to do them anymore. Yet hundreds of agents on a daily basis don't have this document. And how interesting, Gary goes to the number one example of where that bra is very beneficial, because what he didn't tell you is if that situation does happen and you do have the bra and they do mysteriously or probably, like Gary said, go and strike a deal with the builder, and I don't take any pride in this, but that's when that conversation goes back to the builder and says, hey, FYI, they got a signed buyer's rep agreement with me. And now the builder might be like, well, all right, we'll go ahead and handle that. Or the builder might be like, well, that just sounds like a problem between you and the buyer. And if that's the case, it is a problem between us and the buyer, because if you read that buyer's rep very carefully, it does specifically say that they will owe us that type of money if the seller, in fact, does not pay. So Gary brings up the one that is the most important reason to have that bra, because you're like, no, I don't care what you do at this point, but that is getting paid. Now, we're not going to get into the conversation of whether we enforce that or not. That is a whole nother conversation. And it's probably one of the biggest disappointments. Jim?
I mean, that exact scenario has happened a number of times. I had a spec hound representing a builder on, and the client will walk up and they fall in love with the house, but they've been working with this agent that's been taking them all over creation, showing them homes, and then they come sit down, they cut a deal with us, and Gary's right. All of a sudden, the builder's dropping that 3% mysteriously, and the deal gets done, and then I get a phone call from that agent going, hey, has so-and-so been by? I represent them. And I mean, we already got the deal done. It's fine.
Yeah, it's super uncomfortable.
And then I have to tell them, do you have a buyer's rep? Because that's your own hope at this point.
That's right. It's unfortunate too, and I didn't plan on this being part of the conversation, but I'm going to say it just because it happened a couple of times this week. And it's happened in my entire 20-year career, and I know it's happened in y'all's career too, because it's an ugly truth about real estate, and this is a good takeaway from the show. Well, good or bad, the way you want to take it. There is a terrible sense of, in a very few people, but there are some, they have a sense of evilness in them. And I don't think they realize the consequences of their actions on someone like us. So like, I'm going to share a private one. I had one this week that it was over a 24-hour time frame that I had actually contacted them, but they hadn't contacted me back. And this is a little off subject what we're talking about, but it's in the realm of what they're discussing about whether you have a rep and what the right thing to do is. And they came in and they happened to, they thought I didn't call them. So within 24 hours of them landing, they went and got somebody else to do the deal. It was like a $700K house. They found it in 2 deals. And I haven't even had time to get the buyer rep to them. And I've been talking to these people for a while now, but I hadn't physically gone out and done it. But the point I'm making, her response was, oh, I'm sorry that our schedules didn't work out. That's sorry our schedules didn't work out just cost me $19,000. But to her, it's just a shoulder shrug. It's like, oh well. Just like Jim's people that are buying $1 million house that they've been working with all this time. Oh, well, I'm sorry it didn't work out. It's amazing how innocent people are with, if they lost $19,000, $20,000 or $30,000, they'd probably be vomiting in some type of toilet. Yet when they throw it to us, it's like a piece of candy, right? It's like, here, you should enjoy this. I'm sorry, So there's some truth to that as well. And there is a little bit, that is the tough part about real estate. You have to have real thick skin when we get into this. So I love that conversation. Love how that works into. So the reason why we're talking about this bra, and again, those of you tuning in lately, we're talking about buyer's representation agreement. If you caught the second end of that, this is a set point as we get into the agency conversation, because the listing agreement and the buyer's rep agreement both had the same literature in it about intermediary relationships. It basically tells the clients, or even the customers at that point, if they're not a client yet, it tells them what the responsibilities are. Now, we talked a little bit about this last week. They're never going to understand it. I mean, I personally believe that most agents under 5 years don't understand the subject because they haven't done it enough yet. You probably could even break that into 10 years if they haven't done it enough yet. And to think that someone from the general public who's sitting there listening to us while we're going over that has any idea what's about to hit them is probably remote at best, because they just don't understand the subject. Now, this is important because we're about to get into a live example, which y'all are really going to love, because I've taught this subject for many years, and I have perfected, like in less than 20 minutes, showing you how all this works together. And if you really follow it, all right, it's going to help you as you go through this. And Jim and Gary are going to chime in here because they know these subjects as well. But ironically, one of the best ways to understand intermediary relationships, and it's hypocritical because I'm not a fan of it, is going through an open house. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Because the open house has every type of opportunity for all types of agency to be discussed. Now, I joke about it because historically, open houses aren't the greatest thing. Now, they are right now. I will admit. Let me clarify. Like right now, open houses are good because you'll get some productivity in open house right now. Historically, that's not true. Historically, open houses are a waste of time. It's funny how the general public doesn't even realize that I love, and I said this last week too, but it's always worth repeating. I love it when a seller begs me to do an open house. They're like, well, you're not working hard enough. You need to do an open house. You're kind of chuckling inside. You're like, if you only knew what went on in that open house, I'm the last one that you want doing the open house, because most agents that are doing an open house are trying to secure business that's not going to sell your house. It's going to sell somebody else's. So that's a terrible thing that happens, and it's a reality that the general public has such a disconnect over. But the process that we go through is incredible. So I want to tell you before that we're going to kind of that'll be the kind of the punchline for everything today as we wrap up towards the end here, about 15 minutes or so. I want to talk briefly about the differences between the intermediary, because those are going to be good takeaways, and then I'm going to show you how it flows through the open house scenario, and then we'll end the show that way. So you have two types of intermediary. Excuse me. You have an intermediary with appointments. You have an intermediary without the appointments. Right. The intermediary is always the broker who is always going to be, just like the Latin term of intermediary says, always in the middle. Okay. They are not on one side or the other. They are always in the middle. That's what the intermediary stands for. Okay. So an intermediary with appointments is the easy one. And that's why we're going to talk about it first, because here's the thing. Nothing changes in the intermediary with appointments. It's business as usual. The only difference is we are in fact going to tell those clients, which by the way, they're clients. They have to be clients for us to be in this intermediary. Okay. It drives me crazy when someone doesn't understand that. They have to be clients. When we tell them this, we're going to basically say, just so you know, we work for the same broker and we're getting paid by the same broker. Other than that, everything is the same. We can give them all the advice and opinions we want. Nothing changes. So let's say Jim's the broker and that me and Gary work for him. So let's say Jim's the broker, I'm the listing agent, and Gary brings a buyer client. So I have a listing client, Gary has a buyer client. Gary brings his buyer client to my listing, and we want to do a deal. This is a classic example of an intermediary with appointments. Jim appoints Gary to the buyer, and he appoints me to the seller. It's not some type of graduation with tassels crossing. It is assumed that he has made the appointments, okay? So we have now been given the instruction that we can continue on, but we just have to tell him that we work for the same broker. This is for another show, but the way that's done is through an intermediary relationship notification document. It basically says what I just told you. We appoint this person to that one, and we appoint this person to that one.
Right.
That's it. All right. And there's really, if you want to really look at the negatives, the only one close that you can really come to, and it so rarely happens, if you're in a mom and pop organization where there's only 2 or 3 agents and this situation happens, some could argue that there's a little bit of difficulty because even though they're able to give advice and opinions, are they really not doing things that's in benefit of the broker, and are they colluding? It's rare. Like when you're in the bigger firms, and bigger firms, I'm even defining by 10 or 15 agents, you really don't have to worry about that. The agents rarely interact with each other. You want to know a funny thing about a disconnect? A lot of people, even if you're concerned that the 2 agents work for the same firm, that's actually the situation that you probably want, because most of the agents don't like each other in the brokerage and they want to do better than the other agents. So you're probably going to be represented better in that situation than if it was with an entirely different broker. But in the end, same thing, no big deal. Easiest part about the conversation. Intermediary without, far different, far uglier, and extremely discouraged by a majority of the brokers in the state of Texas. And quite honestly, my personal belief at some point might be washed away altogether, because sometimes some people will just say it just doesn't make sense to do it like that. So in this situation, and I teach like this a lot, you can read books all you want, but it's these examples, like even watching the show and the way we're kind of role playing this helps you when you get out there, because you can go back to this. You wouldn't remember if we were giving you a bunch of verbal, but you can certainly remember if you go back to the example that we're doing. So in this one, Gary's not involved anymore. Let's say I bring one of my buyer clients to my listing client, okay? This is an intermediary without appointments. Jim is not going to appoint anybody to either side. So I'm responsible. Both these people are my clients, but here's the difference, and it's a big one. Now at this point, I can no longer give advice and opinions to either of those sides. And y'all, if the wheels are spinning fast enough and the mouse is going fast enough this afternoon, that makes it very difficult on several different platforms to do what we are trying to do. The first platform that's very difficult is that both of these individuals originally employed us so that we could give them advice and opinions on this transaction.
Mm-hmm.
If we did our job correctly, both of them were told that this is a possibility, because we would have read it in the buyer's rep agreement and the listing agreement, and actually in the information about brokerage services. Buyers and sellers are told a minimum of 3 times before they get into an intermediary that it's a possible. And then there's even a 4th time, because on the contract itself, it says they're agreeing to it. So 4 times, right? And in this situation, where it starts to get ugly is both these people were looking for advice and opinions. So if you're looking at who probably should be more irritated, both of them are probably annoyed by it. But if you want to talk about the person who's probably going to be really annoyed by it, it's going to be the seller. Because the seller, if they did not understand what intermediary was in the beginning, which they don't, okay, now that they're being told, hey, look, I can no longer give you advice and opinions, they're like, whoa, hang on. When you came in here, you said you were going to help me do this and give all the advice and opinions. I'm like, yeah, I know. I go, but when you were eating that 12-inch hoagie and watching the Stars game, I told you about intermediary. You weren't listening to me, that this is a possibility. And now it's reality. So now they're listening. Now they're like, oh, I go, I don't like this. I don't like being told I don't give advice and opinions. And you know what they really don't like? Being the seller? Guess what has not changed from the original conversation? They are still going to be paying 6%. So their original assumption was they were paying 3 to the listing agent and 3 to the buyer agent. But they made the assumption it was going to be another brokerage. And in this situation, it's not. So now they start getting steamed by this, because now they're still paying the same amount and they're not getting advice and opinions. Okay. So that's one setting over here.
First thing in their mind, Robert, is what am I paying you for then?
Yeah.
They say
Bingo.
that anyways, don't they?
Yeah. Well,
You're basically telling them, hey, I'm representing the buyer, but I can't tell you whether they'll take what they'll are willing to offer for your property.
That's right.
You know, who would want that?
and here's something in your previous example is it really gets complicated. And this is why most brokers highly discourage, and some even really prohibit intermediary without appointments, because their errors and omissions insurance will not cover that scenario.
Right.
But what if that buyer that you walk into your seller's listing with is your brother? Uh-oh. So wait a minute here.
Or on the same breath, and we see this a lot too, a mega team on the same team, because that's something the state has struggled with greatly. Like, well, they're different agents. I'm like, yeah, but they work for the same dude, you know? So that's been a problem as well. That's a great point. Yeah, it's a great point when family's involved or anybody within the internal system. So I love that. So buyer's got issues too. So here's something a lot of people get confused on, and why the buyer is at a terrible disadvantage compared to the seller. With the seller, previous to this, we already gave them a ton of our advice and opinions when we did the listing appointment. We told them how much their house was worth. We told them how much people were going to offer. We told them what they should list it at. and what they were probably going to get back. We told them everything. We spilled our guts. In fact, the most intelligent sellers out there, after they hear a listing appointment, they probably should say, oh, I don't need you anymore. I got it. Thanks. Now, that's not true because the tail end of this is pretty difficult, but it's a huge piece. With the buyer, we typically don't give advice and opinions to the buyer until they said that they want to put a contract or an offer on it, or they want to put an offer on a house. And then they start asking, well, how much do you think we can offer? So in this situation, my buyer asked the obvious. Well, how much do you think I should offer one? I know you're probably going to not remember, but we discussed this. And I can't tell you that because I represent them too. And that's when they get steamed. They're like, what are you talking about? I thought we agreed that we were gonna do this. I'm like, I know, but you weren't listening. I go, now you're having to listen. In fact, we can't do that. So they get upset. It's funny, a lot of times some people, one of the obvious questions that a buyer will ask is, well, if you can only give me factual information, then I want the comps. I'm like, I go, now we're getting into a bigger issue. Comps, and this is a great takeaway from the show today, even for a veteran agent out there. Comps are not factual information. They are privileged information because the only way you can access it is going through a board of realtors and having access to an MLS. And that is privileged information. So it actually is advice and opinions. You can't just give it out because if you are an intermediary and the buyer asks for the comps, and this happens all the time, it's happening right now somewhere. Somebody's doing this right now. The buyer asked for the comps for the house and the agent's like, oh, well, it's factual, so I can give it to them. They failed to say that they overpriced this house by like $30,000. So now we give them these comps that are basically saying, well, I'm not going to offer this. So now we've hurt the seller who we're supposed to be representing. So you can't do that. We don't allow that type of stuff in there. So this gets very difficult when you have these situations. And here's the silver lining to it. It's just like Gary said, nobody wants to take this route. Most of the brokers have prohibited it because it's way too risky. Even the skilled brokers, even someone like if we're out there, we have to be careful with what we're doing when we go through these types of transactions. So it's extremely discouraged. It's, in my opinion, that it'll probably fade away someday. Now, one of the easier punchlines to this conversation, and this is a great takeaway as well, if you're sitting there saying, well, then what do we do if that's the case? The answer is very obvious. We already said that the intermediary with appointments was really not an issue. We continue to give advice and opinions to everybody. Right. Most of the time when this situation comes up, we are going to suggest that, hey, look, are you okay with if we give you somebody else to come in? We've already gone through a majority of this with you, but we want you to still get your advice and opinions. We'd like you to go through this particular individual. Are you okay with that? And then we get back to intermediary with appointments, and advice and opinions are all better. And that's all they care about. All they care about is getting their advice and opinions. That is the preferred way we do that. Now, the show's too short to discuss the intricacies of that because the other side of this is that means we have to maybe give up some money to another agent. And some of us don't like doing that. So we'll talk about that at some other point. I just didn't want to go through that topic without acknowledging it. Okay, go ahead.
The only way I've seen that intermediary work without appointments is you really have to have a very sophisticated buyer.
Great point.
And seller understand.
One of the rarest times you're actually going to see intermediary, or even the worst case, a modern day sub agency, which is almost impossible, is in fact when you have that type of client, someone who's a skilled investor, someone who doesn't need your advice and opinions, but they need you to open the doors. You will see it in those occasions. They're very small, but that's a great point. You do see that. We see this with the new builder sometimes too, when a new builder asks us to list a house, but they're like, well, look, they define how the clients are going to come in and what you can have. We see a small version there too. So that's a really great point to make. All right. We're going to sum all this up in the easiest example for what I consider to be the most difficult subject in real estate. And it really will make more sense to you as we go through this for the next 5 minutes. So let's go through an open house. All right. Let's say I'm the listing agent and I have an open house and we're going to have these slew of people come through. First person comes in. Now we're actually going to tie together last week's show too, telling you what to do with your disclosure. So we're going to walk you through the models of agency in this next 5 minutes. Okay. Takes like months and years to understand it, but it's really a 5-minute explanation that can get it for you. Okay. So first person walks in. If you were paying attention to last week, you should already know we owe them two types of disclosures if it goes far enough, but one for sure. The moment they come in, we owe them the disclosure of representation. Hi, my name is Robert Mesh. I work for the SWR Group at Keller Williams. I need to let you know that I currently represent the seller. Who I am, who I work for, and who I represent. Bam, right off the bat, just so they know who it is that they're talking to. That has to happen. Now, we talked about a disclosure of agency, which flows into the IABS. We're not there yet. We're going to get to that in this open house conversation. It's not there yet, though, okay? So hold on to that one, because remember, we have to have a face-to-face material conversation with somebody before we are going to acknowledge the IABS. Someone coming into an open house and introducing themselves to us is not yet a material conversation. So let's say this person comes through, we have this conversation, or I'm sorry, this person comes through, they say, hi, you give them their disclosures. They're like, I'm going to go look around. You're like, fine, no problem. Take a 2-minute walk, come back down. Hey, thanks, not what I'm looking for. They walk out the door. From the beginning to the end of that process, that person was a customer to me. They didn't ask me for any advice and opinions. They didn't ask me for anything material about the house. From the beginning to the end, they were a customer, okay? Next person comes into the open house, yada, 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 disclosure of representation. They look through the house. This one comes back and says, hey, I noticed that the guy down the street has the exact same house for sale, but he's $20K less than y'all, and I want to know why that is. Now, here's where a lot of agents start to get in trouble, because the average agent doing an open house right now, they're taught to be polite, be knowledgeable, and answer questions, and there they go. The moment they open their mouth, they're breaking agency law, because whatever's about to come out of their mouth, if it's not, hey, I really can't tell you that because, as I told you, I represent the seller and I'm really not allowed to give you advice and opinions. If it's anything but that, whatever they're about to say is probably going to be in violation of agency law and get them in trouble. Because what most of them are going to say is, you know, that house is a little bit different. We can go look at it after you're done with this one, which is a terrible thing to say when you're trying to sell that particular house. Yet there you have some new agent that was told to go do an open house, and that's the first thing they say. We can go look at that if you don't like this one. Right? Happens all the time. Happened probably 5,000 times this weekend. Probably going to happen another 5,000 times in the upcoming weekend, because people don't know any better. They think they're doing good, but in reality, they're not. So you have all that going on, and they ask you that question. Now, the proper way to answer that question, if you're professional, you're like, hey, look, as I told you when you came in, I represented the seller. I really can't tell you those types of things that revolve around advice and opinions. And then you redirect. Then you're like, well, what did you think about the granite in the kitchen in this house? You want to get them away from the conversation about the other house. You want to redirect and say, what about this? Because remember, our number one priority is to sell that house. Now, if we exhausted all those offers or those efforts, and it is clear that they are not going to buy this house, now we get into the next stage. And the rule of thumb there is, if your seller is sitting in the next room listening to you, and by the way, 63.7% of them are listening to you in one form or fashion. If they listen to everything you said, and when that buyer walks out, they put a hand up and give you a high five and say, you did everything you could. If you've done everything like that, now you can take the next step. Now you can take the next step and says, well, are you interested in anything else? What is it that you're looking for? And the moment they start answering that, now we're having a material conversation that does impose the information about brokerage services. So now we're going to give them the IABS, because remember from our show previous, the IABS is like a Miranda rights for home buyers and home sellers. It tells them what their rights are. And of course, we're lobbying for, we want to do the right that says, look, we want to be your buyer agent, okay? And if it goes far enough and they like us, then we actually sign a buyer's representation agreement, and now they have become a client. Those are the funnels that we're looking through when we're going through and looking at these types of agency. Now, we're running out of time, and there would be one more example I'd give, and I'm not going to do it because it just takes too long, but I'm going to hint at it. One of the bigger problems is, let's say I'm listing a house, and someone comes in who obviously is a customer, they're not my client, and they want to buy the house, but we've read them their rights, and they choose not to want to be a client. They choose that they want to stay a customer. A lot of agents mistake that for an intermediary. Remember, you have to have two clients to have an intermediary. That is not an intermediary transaction. That is a classic customer and client transaction where we are, in fact, going to give advice and opinions to our seller, and that buyer is aware that we are going to do that. Real quick, Mark, before I forget, I want to make sure I put our sponsor information down there. Can you please put in Martin Cooley stuff there? Y'all, Martin, we have a lot of choices when we do our inspections, and we always give 3 options out there because we want the general public to choose what's best for them. But make no mistake about it, the guy we use up here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and he does, if you're in the Austin, San Antonio locations, BPG Inspections is down there too. You can still use this information and get someone who is similar to Martin's level. But up here in Dallas, we use Martin as our primary home inspector. He's fantastic, has great bedside manner, tells everybody exactly what they need to know, but doesn't scare them off. He's become a good friend of ours. He's been with the firm for a long time. All the agents that are out there, I highly suggest if you don't have a really good real estate inspector, you really ought to check out Martin Cooley. We appreciate him being a sponsor on the show. I want to thank everybody out there for watching today. Again, this one on archive will be watched a lot. It'll probably hit anywhere from 700 to 1,000 views just because of the importance. So I encourage you, if you watched it, send it to somebody else and tell them to watch it who's struggling with it. If you have a client who has an issue or a customer who has an issue with understanding this, or you actually are in this situation right now, you should tell them to watch this show too, because I think it's going to help them out greatly. I want to thank my 2 co-hosts today. They're personal, longtime friends of mine, and they are experts in the industry. And I really need to do a better job of having them on because their input is invaluable on this particular show. Jim, thanks for showing up today. Gary, thank you for being on the show. Like I said, appreciate you guys' time. Everybody else, we will see y'all next week, and we'll get some really good topics in there to keep feeding you on, teaching you how to do real estate. Have a good one.
Thank you, Robert.